Hello watch enthusiasts. Now many of us love the aesthetics and designs of vintage watches, but yet due to their lack of reliability we simply can't warrant owning them. Therefore a great many brands have turned to the idea of producing watches which are inspired by the designs of these vintage watches. And so in this video I would like to talk about the best vintage watch remakes by the brands who respectively designed them in the first place. And these range from everything from a very affordable Seiko through to a very illustrious and beautifully made Vulcain. So in this video I would like to make a remake of a video I made about a year ago talking about the best value vintage inspired watches, and turn the question a little bit towards the best remakes, because I feel this is a very interesting topic in the world of homage watches to vintage timepieces. However, before I begin the video, I would like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is my group on Snups, the social media platform for sharing pictures of your collections and interests, and where you can discuss matters of horology with myself and indeed other enthusiasts, and where I'll do my utmost to reply to any questions or video requests you happen to give me. Therefore, I would very much encourage you to follow the link down below, or download the app, which is available for iOS or Android depending on what you're using, and join over 700 other people who are also enjoying these additional features, which I really do feel help the channel and give you a better experience and give you added features on this channel. Now the first watch I'd like to talk about is rather an interesting one, and one which has become a real cult classic amongst watch enthusiasts. And this is the Seiko SAAB017, or the Alpinist. And the Alpinist's origins come from the 50s and 60s, when Seiko produced versions of their dress watches with water resistance and added resilience to the elements for the alpinists who climbed mountains in both Japan and around the world. And these were characterised by having a bit more lume on their dials, in that day would have been radium, as well as a slightly more rugged case with greater water resistance and resilience to bumps, shocks and the general elements along with humidity and water. And so as a result, these became quite interesting in terms of vintage watches. And there was a long period without these watches in the Seiko range, but they reintroduced this style of watch in the 90s, and this is the most recent iteration. And the new version of this watch takes inspiration from these older models, and is a very interesting remake because it doesn't follow the lines perfectly, but certainly takes inspiration from the designs of that era. So for example, the watch is 38mm in diameter, which is a very modest size by modern standards, but still features everything you would expect from a modern sports watch, whilst packaging it in what you would expect to be a dress watch case. Additionally, it is only 12mm thick, which, when you consider the fact that it does have an internal bezel, is actually remarkably good and surprisingly slim considering the features this watch offers. The case of this watch also guarantees 200 metres of water resistance with a screw-down crown, and a thickened sapphire crystal in this case. And this is a rare thing to see on a Seiko, because usually they would use hardlex, but in this case they use sapphire to give a better scratch resistance to the crystal of this timepiece. And the case is also very, very nicely finished, with bevels on both the inside and outside of the lugs, polished sides, brushed tops to the lugs, and that wonderful polished bezel around the edge of the crystal, which again adds a certain dressy and classical aspect to this otherwise quite sporty timepiece. Another curious detail of this watch is the dial, which really is the bit that draws the eye at first. And this features a beautiful sunburst sort of green dial, which is a lighter green than a sort of a British racing green, but still I think retains dark hues which often do catch the light and then become much, much brighter, which helps the watch, I suppose, resemble the landscape that it would normally be used in. And this is only brought out by the use of these gold hands and gold applied indices on the dial, along with the gold Seiko logo. And there is lume on the dial as well, with these small dots around the edge, though certainly the vast majority of the lume are on those large cathedral hands, which are beautifully finished, and I think really do add to the design of this watch as far as a vintage sports watch goes. Furthermore, around the edge of the dial you see a far more complicated section, which is a modern type of bezel, which works as a compass. And the reason for this, according to various people, is because up in the mountains and high up there were problems with magnetism with compasses due to the large amount of ores in the mountains. And so as a result, using your watch was often a more reliable sort of means of gauging your direction than a normal magnetically orientated compass. Of course, even at this price point, this Seiko does feature an in-house Seiko movement, and certainly the movements seen in these watches are relatively high-end for Seiko. They are the 6R15, which seriously outdo the NH35, for instance, or indeed the various 4R models. And so you get an automatic 23 dual movement with a 45 hour power reserve, though they quote it as being slightly lower. These do often extend into the 50 hours in certain cases. And you do also have a sort of hacking and hand winding setup, so you can hand wind this automatic watch if you need to, as well as stopping the second hands for ease of setting, which are again features which are becoming more and more common on Seiko watches, but certainly seeing the 6R15 is a real pleasure on this watch, and I think makes the watch all the more attractive for a buyer. The pricing of this watch is also relatively modest, being between £300 and £400 depending on where you buy it from, which is quite remarkable for the detailing on this watch with that beautifully finished case, those very, very nicely finished crowns with the various textures on them which are also signed, and that wonderful dial and movement which are of course in-house. Again, a real credit to what Seiko can offer for a wonderful price. The second watch I'd like to talk about is the Tissot 1936 Heritage, and this is a piece designed after the trench watches produced in the early 20th century, as well as throughout the 1920s and 30s for members of the armed forces. And these were watches which were designed originally as pocket watches, but were then welded onto to lugs, or rather had lugs welded to them, which allowed a strap to be passed through and to be worn on the wrist of a soldier. And this came about through the problems with regards to using a pocket watch in combat, because of course you had to put your gun down or hold it in one hand, which when you're using a large bore, a sort of a full power battle rifle, so say a Lee Enfield, or the equivalent firing a relatively powerful round, you couldn't really fire that with one hand if you were in the middle of checking the time. So as a result, the wristwatch became more and more popular throughout those years, as they would have called it then the campaign watch. And so Tissot have drawn from this in this new creation. And this watch is a 45mm by 12.98mm case, so it is quite large, but certainly does adhere to the size of the pocket watches of the day. And it features a two-tone enamel dial, which is a really wonderful thing to see, because you see a darker grey section in the centre of the dial, with the traditional Tissot logo, which is placed below those beautiful blue Breguet-style hands, which are blued steel, as well as the small seconds at 6 o'clock. Also, you do see the numerals, which are very much of the era around the dial, and do lend to a very attractive aesthetic, with the military time running around the edge of the dial, again lending to that military functionality that was so essential for this timepiece in the era. Now, the large polished case of the watch is really a beautiful piece because it's very, very nicely curved over its sides, and flows seamlessly into that sapphire crystal on the front of the watch. Additionally, they haven't overcomplicated it with a date or anything of that nature, and have left a simple polished section in the centre of the hands, rather than having any complicated mechanisms visible. It's as simple as the watch can possibly be made. Now, this does come onto the lugs, because they don't have lugs like, for example, a Panerai does with its wire lugs, but rather these are exact replicas of the originals. So these are lugs which are fixed. So they're pass-through lugs, so you have to use a one-piece strap for this, or sew a strap onto the watch. And for some this will be a deal-breaker, but for me, I think this just adds to the aesthetic of the timepiece, and these single-piece straps are very easily available for this timepiece. And of course that does also mean that you have no risk whatsoever of a spring bar breaking, because they're not on this watch, which again does add to the practicality, I suppose, of this timepiece if you plan to use it very regularly. Now, the case back of this watch is a really wonderful aspect, because it has a hunter-style case back. And these were seen originally on pocket watches, where the caseback would flip open to reveal the movement. But bearing in mind that a modern watch has to be water resistant to some extent, and this watch is water resistant to 30 metres, thanks to that large onion crown, which is beautifully decorated and kept small to not protrude too much and really affect the wrist whilst wearing it. But the caseback of this watch flips open on a hinge, and under that you see a sapphire crystal displaying the Unitas 6498. -1, which is the movement used in this watch, and is one of the oldest movements known to be still used. And it's a very simple manually wound 17 jewel movement, but is extremely reliable, very large, and gives you a beautiful view of the inside of the mechanisms. Similarly, this is the base movement on a lot of Panerais, which again adds to the value of this timepiece. Of course, the movement is manually wound, which means that you will be using that crown to wind it up each morning or every 2 days, which I think adds to the involvement of the owner in this timepiece, and I think really does help the watch become more of a sort of a ceremonial piece, if you see what I mean. You have to put a certain degree of effort into the watch in the morning, you have to wind it up, which in my eyes just adds to the interest of this piece and makes it all the more appealing as far as a watch for someone who enjoys the vintage. Now, the next watch is the Seiko Marinemaster 300. And this is a piece which has become extremely popular with a great deal of vintage watch lovers. And it was very easy to leave this watch out of the video and use the Tudor Black Bay instead as the primary dive watch in this video. But I think that would be unfair, because whereas the Tudor Black Bay is a mishmash of different Tudor references, and doesn't really adhere to the proportions of the original, the Marinemaster 300 is a true reference to the original reference 6159 from 1968. And this was a monoblock dive watch from Seiko, and was a response to various claims that Seiko watches simply weren't up to the water resistance expected. And this watch is a 300-metre diver, though it is tested 375 metres due to the 25% overpressure that these watches have to adhere to. And this is a 44mm by 15mm thick watch, making it relatively large and cumbersome on the wrist, but due to its weighting, not uncomfortable having tried one of these pieces on. And the finishing on this watch is exquisite. It really is beautifully done, and is a testament to what Seiko can do, as I said about the Alpinist. And this watch is far closer to a Grand Seiko, really, than a standard Seiko, but nonetheless it features the same name. And the case of this watch is beautifully polished on its sides, with these very thick bevels going across the sides of the case, which break down the slab-sidedness this watch could have. It also has brushed tops to the lugs, as well as a brushed section down the centre of the side of the case, and then a lot of polishing along the edges to make it more comfortable. Furthermore, the front of the case features this very large and easily gripped bezel, with these large teeth, but not an overbearingly thick bezel as well. On top of the bezel you see a bezel insert, which is made of stainless steel, which is then lacquered in a very traditional sort of process, which is typical of Seiko's manufacturing. And this doesn't offer the scratch resistance of, for example, ceramic or sapphire, but it does give a wonderful gleam which those simply can't match, and an element of craftsmanship that isn't seen on those. The dial of this watch is also beautifully done in matte black, with these wonderful applied indices, as well as the applied Seiko logo, which matches those wonderful brushed and loomed hands. The dial also features a very interesting chapter ring, which adds depth to the dial, whilst keeping the aesthetic of the original watch from the 60s. Additionally, the second hand and the other hands actually are also very much in keeping with that watch, with their beveled edges and very large loom areas, which, as you can tell on these watches, is entirely hand-applied, and this watch is hand-assembled. Additionally, the watch does feature the necessary detailing that you would expect from Seiko, with the applied indices, and the due care with the dial and the date aperture, which is all beveled and very nicely finished. Furthermore, the case of this watch does feature an interesting quirk, which is that it is a monoblock case, which means that there is no opening case back. Everything has to be done through the front of the watch. And this is done by popping the bezel off, because it's simply a sort of a friction fit with the bezel. It is clicking with 120 clicks, and very, very little play in this bezel as well. But it will pop off if you apply enough pressure, and under that there are the necessary grips you would normally see on the back of a watch's case to unscrew the front of the dial, which can then be lifted out, and you can service the movement that way. But there is no opening case back on this watch, which does add, I feel, to the curious and altogether more reliable diving aspects of this watch, because there are less seals to fail. Seiko haven't, however, left out any of the decoration, because they still do apply the Hokusai style of woodblock print wave on the caseback as well, which is applied to the surface of that brushed caseback, which again does add to the beauty of this watch, which is designed to be a heritage-inspired style of dive watch, but still with professional credentials. And this is actually a saturation diver as well, so it can take helium and the dangers of those pose to watches without a helium escape valve. The bracelet is also very interesting because it has these very long links which slip around the wrist very well and are quite slim as well to account for the added heft of the watch. And it does also have a ratcheting clasp, which is very comfortable to wear, but also allows you to adjust it very extensively to a wetsuit, or simply to the changes in your wrist size over the year or the temperature. And this does make this £1,600 watch, in my eyes, very, very good value when you take into account the fact that it uses a caliber 8L35 from Seiko, which is to say a Grand Seiko 9S55, which is just not decorated. And this means the watch does feature one of the best movements in the business, with a fantastic architecture which is very reliable, but also does offer the high beat rate that you would expect from Seiko, which is the 4 Hz rate. It's not the full 5 Hz rate, but nonetheless is still a relatively high beat. Additionally, it does also feature a long 50 to 55 hour power reserve, which again adds to the practicality of this watch and the overall value. The penultimate watch in this video is the Longines Avigation BigEye. And despite its rather silly name, this is a very, very interesting piece released very recently by Longines. And this takes inspiration from the watches made in the early 1970s, which ironically does seem strangely late for these watches, which have an aesthetic of far more of a 50s or 60s piece. But nonetheless, these watches were originally made in the 70s, in the early 70s, for military pilots. And so as a result, these watches were designed to be very legible and easy to use, hence the large pushers and the heavily loomed dial. And they've recreated this watch with a fantastic new movement, very good dimensions, excellent design, and a very, very competitive price. And at 41mm in diameter, this is a very reasonably sized piece, and I feel is very fitting considering the fact that this is designed to be a wearable timepiece on an everyday basis. And it features a brushed case with some polished bevels on both the bezel as well as the edges of the case, and also polished large pushers as well as a smaller crown. And the pushers do appear very large at first sight, but are certainly fitting for a pilot who would have to use these with gloved hands, so I think we can excuse that, and I think does add a certain quirk to the design of this watch, which smaller pushers simply wouldn't have done. The dial is a wonderful aspect as well, which under that domed sapphire crystal shows a matte black finish with a simple Longines automatic writing on it, which is really all this watch needs. Additionally, you have the very typical Mark XX style of simple and very legible numerals running around the edge of the dial, as well as a typical sub-dial at 3 o'clock, which is the minutes for the chronograph, which is incidentally a sub-dial which offers a slightly higher legibility than others because it is larger, and so as a result demonstrates the BigEye aspect of the name of this watch. And this was often placed there to time intervals whilst on the ground, as well as being able to judge very quickly the minutes of the chronograph, which were often the most crucial part. Now, as well as having this rather beautiful concentric sunburst effect on these subdials, the subdial at 3 o'clock, which is this enlarged size, also is broken down to 6-minute increments. And this makes it much easier to read because the 2-minute increments on the smaller graduations are much easier to see than 1-minute increments on a normal style of subdial, which again means that Longines have complicated the dial but made it quicker to read, which is an interesting feature and an interesting touch, I feel, altogether. Of course, the other subdials at 6 o'clock at 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock are the running seconds as well as the 12-hour counter, which are again typically Mark XX material, and are again an interesting feature, because normally from a movement which is based on a Avigation 7750, you would have these stacked vertically, but due to the movement in this watch, which really is unique, they have been put in this rather aesthetically pleasing arrangement. And the movement inside this watch is a very curious one from ETA. It's the caliber L688.2, and this is a 4Hz 54-hour power reserve column wheel automatic chronograph. And these are all aspects which you wouldn't see even in an Omega Speedmaster, which is quite remarkable and costs well over £1,000 more than this watch. But the reason why this is so much less is the reason for this is that this movement is not made by Longines. It's an ETA movement, but has been made specifically for Longines by ETA, and isn't used in any other watches from any other brands, though is used in several other models from Longines. So I would regard this in a strange way as an in-house movement, because it was designed for this watch specifically, and this layout, which I think adds credibility to this £1,940 watch, as a really fantastic option for someone who wants a good value and interesting chronograph. Now the final watch I'd like to talk about is a very interesting model from Vulcain, or Vulcain, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And this is the very, very interesting and beautiful Nautical heritage. And this is a piece which takes inspiration from Vulcain's past. And in the past, they produced alarm watches. And in 1858, the brand was established. And since then, were in fact the first brand to incorporate an alarm function into a wristwatch. And this is the direct product of that, and the cricket technology. And the cricket alarm was used in these watches, and indeed in a lot of watches worn by US presidents, due to the functionality of this. But back in the early days of diving, a very similar style of timepiece was used from the Vulcain range for diving in various lakes, and became very well known as a result. And this was an underwater alarm watch. And this features a very different approach to the dive watch, despite being a professionally certified dive watch. I think this is a watch which would take some getting used to for a professional diver, but certainly does offer the functionality you would expect. The price of this watch is significantly higher than the other watches in this video at £3,500, but in terms of functionality and features, this really is pretty much unbeatable for this price, and you need to really double or triple that price to get it from any other brand. And this is bearing in mind a fully Swiss-made watch. but features a fully polished 42mm case with 22mm lug width, which makes it sit very comfortably on the wrist and is the right size for the vast majority of people to wear, and sits very comfortably as well due to that large seated strap. Furthermore, the functions of this watch are really tremendous and incorporated into that beautiful vintage style of dial. And the dial features that wonderful angled chapter ring, as well as the rather interesting style of central dial section, which is all loomed as well. And the movement inside this watch is the in-house caliber V10, a twin-barrel manually wound 42-hour power reserve movement with an alarm function. And the alarm function is wound from the central crown, which is used to wind both of the barrels in different directions. And this means that even if you use the alarm and it runs its barrel down, the watch will not stop, which is a very helpful feature. And that's shown by the small red-tipped hand on the dial. And whether the alarm is on and off is controlled by that small button at 2 o'clock, which can be pressed in to turn off the alarm once it's been armed. Additionally, at the 4 o'clock position, you have a bezel which is controlled by that crown at the 4 o'clock position. And that's this internal section on the internal ring of the dial. And what this means is that you can set the watch up to show you your decompression stops on the dial, which is a really brilliant and very, very clever and innovative design, which I feel is really unseen on other watches, and is a sort of a dead principle, really, from other brands, which is a shame, I feel, because it is a curious thing to have, and though not particularly useful on a day-to-day basis, you can still use it as a sort of a rudimentary internal bezel, due to the fact that it does have those small loomed indices around its edge. And the crowns don't screw down on this watch either, because it does have a super compressor style of case, whereby the crowns get pressed in by surrounding water pressure, which again increases water resistance and does mean that you can actually operate the pusher underwater, as well as, if you needed to, the crowns. Though, of course, it's not recommended at the full 300 metres, it wouldn't theoretically cause any water ingress, which is a further testament to the technology put into these watches, with a 300 metre water resistance. And the calibers used in these watches, the V10, are again a real thing of beauty to behold, with a completely unique architecture, and really beautiful finishing, especially for this price, considering the fact that Vulcain are a smaller brand, and really shouldn't be able to produce such beautiful pieces, yet are churning them out with new iterations being released very regularly. But they really do the watches which they provide in a very interesting and subdued way, which appeals to both the vintage lover as well as the lover of the high quality and an interesting Swiss wristwatch. Anyway though, I'll conclude the video here because I feel I've covered these several watches which I feel are excellent value for what they offer, and really do present wonderful different aspects at different price points. So thank you very much for watching, and please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to enjoy more content here in future. Also, do leave your comments down below about what you think of these various watches and what they offer to the watch community. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, over and out.